Welcome to another episode of Always Be Connecting. Today we're going to talk about neurodiversity in the workplace, and here to help us understand how to be sensitive and inclusive to our colleagues is the director of Aspire, is an early intervention program, and this is Dianne Verstappen.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me on, Lindsay.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. What is Aspire? And how did you get to being the director?
Sure. I originally came to Australia about 30 years ago. I've always worked with children. I initially did a education degree, physiotherapy, came to Australia, started working with children with autism spectrum disorder, then opened up a small early intervention practice, predominantly working with children with ASD, and then became a board-certified behaviour analyst. And over the last 17 years, we've gradually grown and we've been really supportive, predominantly for young children who are autistic or have autism.
What was there a driver behind your...
Just wanting to help children, just seeing, that a lot of children with additional needs, creating an environment for them to get their potential, to meet their potential, and then also seeing how we can create an environment with the parents to support that.
Yeah, okay. And what's the difference you've seen in the life from when you started to now?
Oh, it's changed a lot. Different ideas about how disability is perceived, how autism is perceived, the way that we talk about autism. And so with that changing environment and more awareness predominantly as well, as in Australia, there's also more funding available. And so how can we best meet those needs of those children and those families?
So let's talk a little bit about the sort of the early intervention child aspect of neurodiversity before we get into how we work with colleagues. So what are the signs of of a need, and what are sort of like the first few months of intervention?
Yeah, so we like to start with children as young as possible because then sometimes the delay or the impairment is not so great. So if you have a child, for example, at around 2, they should have more than 10 words. They should put 2 words together. They should point instead of dragging you by the hand. They should have a wide variety of interests. They should be socially engaged, like peekaboo games. So if you don't quite see that in a 2-year-old, well, you can start looking a little bit further, but doesn't mean that a child necessarily will get a diagnosis of ASD. It just means that is there anything to support that development? Because we know that those are behavior cusps to access more things in your environment. So when we see that, so for us, we don't need a diagnosis to start services, but obviously there's sometimes can be funding attached. But we just, for us, the diagnosis is not so relevant. So whether a child has a diagnosis of autism, ADHD, we like to meet families and the children where they're at and what kind of support they need. So we often look at what we call functional impairment. How can we work with the child's environment to get those behavioural cusps, talk, communication, more play skills, wider variety of interests without stifling that creativity or that different way of thinking. So it's a fine balance and looking at how we can support children thrive. And for young children, it often ties in with toilet training. That might take longer, for example, or learning to communicate might take a little bit longer. Yeah.
So what are some ideas from your educational background that are key to unlocking something in children that wasn't there before? So
the thing to look at is you need to see each individual in their environment with their at the stage of where their development is at. Children, typically developing children, they develop at different rates, and so do children potentially with an ASD diagnosis or who are neurodiverse. So what you want to do is look at how you can meet that child's needs, look what's socially valid in the environment, because also families have different cultural beliefs, and they're all in different environments. Some live in an apartment. They don't have access, to playing outside, different preschool setups. And so what you'd want to do is look at the family, look at the child's environment, and then support that learning in that particular preschool with that particular family's values. So it's more, I would say a life coach, but it's like a family coach, and then working with other allied health professionals. And what you want to do is give that little child the opportunity to be their best, to get all that capacity, that capability out. Because every child is capable of learning. Sometimes they're not in the right environment. And so it's scaffolding that environment and giving that support to families. Those children can meet, fantastic outcomes. But it's hard. It takes a lot of work for families.
There's a phrase that goes around that everybody's got a little bit of something. Hey? So... and I really like the way that you're talking about looking at the wider picture for everything. What's their home environment? What are their likes? What are their dislikes?
Yeah, that's right.
And catering for that. Is that something that is missing in other places, or is it because they're more on that side of things that it is becoming detrimental to be in this kind of one size fits all?
Yeah, I think that you were asking before about things having changed. So I think because there's more awareness, people want to help more, and there's not so much stigma attached anymore to having a diagnosis with ASD. So families often seek out more support. Also with the NDIS, there is more funding available and earlier.
Yeah.
And so what we like to do is work with those families. The other thing that we do as an intervention service provider is we're more like key workers. We work with a variety of professionals, so everyone's on the same page. For example, if you have a 3-year-old child that can't speak yet, so can't use their vocal voice, then are we going to put another system in place? Are we going to put picture exchange communication in place where children communicate by pictures or sign? But if you do that, you want to try and do that with everyone involved, with the speech pathologist, the occupational therapist, the family. And so you need to work together as a team to create the maximum outcome. Because if one professional says, hey, you need to do PECS, but the family prefers sign, well, it doesn't really work. So you choose as a supportive community around this little boy or girl, you find an environment, or you create an environment where that child can thrive. And that takes a lot of communication, and people have different ideas about what that might look like. But it's really working collaboratively as a team to make these things happen.
And this might be contradicting what you're saying, but do people with ASD have typical superpowers? Things that if they are more visual,
that's a very good question. So I think because they're more diverse, they can have certain strengths. So they might be more creative, and also sometimes some of our children have a hyper focus, so they develop those skills more. So we want to nurture that and foster that, but we also want to be very careful that it doesn't go at cost of a functional ability. For example, I've worked with an adult who is not toilet trained but was fantastic on the piano. So someone had to go with this person to go to the toilet, and he had to have a carer, but he was great on piano. That was his superpower. So what we want to try and do is we want to foster that functional independence, functional communicating, so they get their needs met. But at the same time, we also want to foster if there's a special interest or if there's a special superpower. So you want to do both, but it's time related. But we live in a world where there's lots of demands, and if as children get older and they can't cope with work demands, or they can't cope with being in a busier environment and they can't communicate, hey, I need a break, that creates anxiety and depression. And so what we want to try and do, we want to give our children that resilience to be able to advocate, and that's teaching that skill. That takes time, and it sometimes may go at a little bit of a cost of getting that super hyper focus in one particular area, but it's finding that balance.
So interesting as well, because you obviously, as a director of a business, you manage a team and you manage a lot of people with varying skills as well. So it's a very amazing lesson to learn from ASD in children, that everybody has strengths, places where they need a lot of support. And then also parts of their personality that need to be acknowledged in a certain way. So and I think it as well in the last 20 years or however long, that there has been a change in how people manage teams of you know, being able to have more fluidity in everybody's roles and bring them up to speed and stuff. Are there things that you know from your work that you can bring in as a team leader to foster that?
Yeah, I think the same as when we look at children and their environment, and your organization is just another microcosmos of an environment. And so when you run an organization, you don't want carbon copies of yourself, because the creativity and the ideas are very narrow. So when you employ different people, when you interview them or when you onboard them and even down the track, what you want to do is you want to really look at what is their strength, and then you want to facilitate that. And if they need any adaptations, you can work together collaboratively again. How can you get the best out of your team member? So if they prefer working in a quieter space or with different lighting, but then they bring something extra that neurotypical individuals or maybe the rest of your team can't provide, that's really what you want to foster. That you want to have happy employees, but you also want to bring the best out of them, and that is by having a conversation and working collaboratively with them. What do you need? I like what you're doing. This is your strength. What do you need to get that from you so our organization can thrive? Sometimes what you see in meetings or in boardrooms, when everyone is the same, it's like an echo chamber. You don't want an echo chamber. You always create like a little bit of positive dissent. You want people to say, hey, but what about this? And then it's part of the team and creating a culture where you listen to that. If everyone goes, yeah, that's great, your focus becomes just really, really narrow, and I think it stifles growth in organizations.
Because it's interesting, because when I first was writing notes to do this podcast, it was more towards what kind of language do we use around people with ASD or ADHD or anything like that. But what I'm gaining from you is it's not so much knowing everybody's diagnosis and responding with whatever WebMD is telling us to do, but it's more appreciating everybody's strengths and weaknesses and having an awareness. And
and so autistic people or people with autism, if they can communicate their needs, and if organizations and especially team leaders or managers, if they're open to listening to again what they need, then you really get the best out of them. I think supporting that, I can't think of any other examples. Working in an environment and facilitating that communication and that conversation, and sometimes understanding that communication can be difficult, or like for example, social referencing or eye contact for some people who are neurodiverse can be more difficult. Well, does that really matter? You know, if you get the job done. So being accepting of people's differences and then supporting that.
Do you think that employers have a right to know? Do you think employees who have a diagnosis should
Look,
put that forward?
no, if the individual feels that it's helpful, and sometimes people are very proud to be diagnosed autistic, if you don't, it's up to the individual. But I think steering away from a diagnosis, because you just look at the individual. Who are you as a person in this work environment or in this home environment? I think it's a lot more important. Does it matter if you have if a diagnosis with ADHD? Sure, it can help. It might help with medication or dyslexia. People understand that. But at the end of the day, you're just working with an individual. So the label is just a label, because ADHD might look different for two people. Autism might look different for, there's no single person that's the same who have an ASD diagnosis. And so I think really, does it matter? Only if it matters to the individual. But for an organisation, you still don't know anything about the person when they say, I'm diagnosed with autism.
The word diagnosis is so impersonal.
Yeah, there's such a scope of skill sets and, needs that need to be supported. So I think it's really having that conversation with the individual. We like you for these and these reasons. That's why we hired you. We like to support you and grow in the organisation. What do you need? How can we facilitate that? But then again, that really goes for any employee. Yeah.
So are there approaches that you see that counteract a supportive and helpful and inclusive workplace?
I think making sure, I think as a manager, that you're listening and hearing people, and not being dismissive or thinking that you know it all. Yeah. I was a sole director and a business owner, and I know what I don't know. And so it's always important to go to the experts and get more advice, and also continuing to learn. And so really listening to other people when they tell you something, I think is really important. I like also giving people autonomy in their job. I don't like micromanagement. I don't think people in general like to be micromanaged. But then also saying to individuals, what do you need? Come to me if you have questions, because I'm happy to support you. Because it's really give and take in an organisation.
And is there ways to see if somebody is struggling with their neurodiversity that needs to be addressed? It's we're all looking out for each other here. It's not just a manager's job, it's everybody's job to look for when people are struggling.
Yeah, I think doing regular check-ins, and then also understanding that people have different personalities, and so finding a direct manager or a buddy that a person trusts. So if they don't feel comfortable to go to, a manager, having a peer buddy or a colleague that is maybe aware, and to do that check-in regularly, and understanding as an executive team, hey, I think this person's not doing well, but I'm not the person going to be checking in, because for whatever reason, I think it might be better if this person does it because they have a better relationship. So I think just really supporting, and also having an open culture and having your values in your organisation and policies aligned with, it's okay to ask for help. It's okay if you don't do so well. It's also there's also a responsibility as an employee. Hey, we can help you. And if you model that behaviour, and if people can see that, it's much easier than for a person to step up.
Because we've all had jobs given to us that were just a little bit out of our scope abilities.
And so, asking for that help, but also understanding stress and anxiety or depression. It's not just in the workplace, it comes from the wider environment. So again, understanding that environment and supporting, if you have a family with young children, or if you have an employee that has two children and maybe one of them has a diagnosis or a developmental delay, understanding that it's stressful. So people are employees, but they also have their own lives, and how it's like you work as a community. And I truly believe that an organization works well if you support employees in their everyday life, because at the end of the day, they're there to do a job, but it's just a job, you know?
Sometimes, I rightly or wrongly, I'm saying this, the pressures of a job in people with neurodiversity might cause them to go AWOL, or them to have a gap that they can't bridge emotionally.
Yeah.
Is there a way to deal with that you can
So about
share?
30% of adults who are diagnosed with ASD, they are unemployed, because sometimes it's a little bit harder to find the right job for the right person. So with the change over the last 20 years and becoming more aware, there's more organisations that support specifically adults who are neurodiverse and try to match organisations that need that specific skill set. So I think if you're looking for someone with a specific skill set, or if you're diagnosed or you're neurodiverse, you can go to specialist agencies that then can support those needs.
And how are there employers that specifically put in programs to cater for the neurodiverse, and are there extra steps and processes?
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit on what kind of organisation. We're a very public-facing, client-facing organisation, so sometimes it can be difficult for people who are neurodiverse. But we have team members who are in operations or in the back end, and they can be very hyper-focused on operational procedures. So that can work really, really well, because they can really focus on those procedures that need to be precise, analytical. They like to get them checked again. And so sometimes it is really an advantage. But it's having that ongoing conversation. What do you need as an individual? So I can't really give any specific ideas. Could be lighting. I've worked with people who had a clinic in Canberra, and the lighting was just terrible. So we just changed the lighting. Sometimes noises, sometimes having to deal with it, like front facing, so dealing with a lot of people. If that's not preferred, obviously you need to be able to have a conversation. But they might not go into like debt collection or complaint management, where you need to do a lot of direct facing with clients. Or maybe sometimes that could be a skill, because they're not, maybe don't get so personally affected because they just understand that they're following those procedures.
So how can hiring managers be more inclusive in their hiring process?
I think when you do an interview, going over some of those policies, and it's the same with gender diverse people, you want to be open about the values of your organisation, because when you do job interviews, it's not so much an organisation saying, yes, you are a good fit, but it's also you're interviewing the organisation. Are you a good fit for me? And so, and it sort of ties back in with that early intervention piece, teaching children and giving them autonomy and choice. And teaching them to ask for what they need instead of engaging in problem behaviour, for example. Well, it's the same with, parents of adolescents or young adults, or when people do job coaching. No, you can ask questions, because you want to make sure that the organisation is right for you. And when things don't go well, or they don't meet your needs, well, you can go and ask for what you need. It's collaboration. You get the best out of an employee if you're on the same page.
Yeah. And what about resources for people who are neurodiverse looking for work? Are there ways to that there are understand what's going on a bit better?
Yeah, so there are organisations that can support. I know Aspect in New South Wales does quite a bit of work. So there are a variety of organisations. There's also an organisation, and I think you say it's Specialist, and Vicky Little works there. So I know they do a lot of work in supporting individuals finding workplaces that match their skill set.
Because I think it's going to be so important. It is so important, but times are changing. You know, like that. Supporting that kind of diversity in the workplace hasn't had the prevalence that it possibly.
I think maybe it was always there, but people maybe just got fired because there were no changes and they were not supportive. Now, because there is more awareness, I think organisations want to, that the values are changing. So I think good organisations, they stay with the times and they're open to that change. Whereas before, I think more people were unemployed, whether they had a diagnosis or not, because I think organisations were maybe not as supportive. So they just were unemployed. I think that's the difference.
Is there, so I know from my daughter who goes to Aspire that we needed to change our behaviour of how we interact with her. So there must be different managerial styles that you need to adopt with different people. So some people respond better to kindness and some people respond better to directness. What's your perspective of that?
Yeah, so when we work with families like yourself, we ask, what are your needs? What are your little girl's needs? What motivates them? For example, for communication, we might do a preference assessment. We might say, what does she like most? How can we get her to communicate for that? And you do the same thing in a workplace. What makes you happy in the workplace? How can we get you to perform to the best of your ability? And understanding that individuals who are neurodiverse, they do have a separate interest. Can we, oftentimes that's why you want to hire them, because they have that very specific interest. So how can you use that specific interest, because it's motivating? How can you use that then to bring an extra dimension to your workplace? Yeah, and it's often finding the right people that match what you're trying to achieve there.
And then being able to bring results back from somebody who's maybe not results driven, or
it is a conversation. Obviously, if you're in a business or an organization, you need to get results and you need to get an end product, whether that's a product that you're designing, or whether it's creative marketing, or whether it's having a variety of entrepreneurial or business ideas. So you can be very explicit, and with some people you can be incredibly explicit, but do you do that verbally? Do you write it down? Having clear measures in place. Does the individual that you're working with, do they want a weekly check-in, a daily check-in? Look, what do they prefer? And that's very different. And if it doesn't work, it's also, I think, as a business owner and as a manager, you do need to have that conversation. Just because they have a diagnosis doesn't mean that they can't perform.
Yeah.
You just, I see that with children as well. Sometimes families get really worried when children do receive an ASD diagnosis, and the expectation drops on what they can do. But if the expectation drops, children often perform to that expectation. So I think having realistic but high expectations, and it's the same, I think, in the workplace. Because you have a diagnosis doesn't mean that you can't perform, but you also need to be held accountable. So again, it goes both ways, as long as that conversation is there. And in reality, not all workplaces are suited to that individual, or that individual is not suited. But again, it's 50-50. And so as people become more aware, it is really in that recruitment process, the initial onboarding, to make sure that it fits. And you still can't fit, a square in a round hole. But can we make the edges a little bit smoother? Can we make the circle a little bit more square so it does fit? Because we do want to support people, especially if you work in an organization, that has humanistic values. Well, we're here to help people. Any workplace, if they're very revenue driven, and if it's just product based, sure, but that's not my type of organization. So does that fit? I'm not sure, but I think most humanistic organizations, they would have similar values in wanting to work with people and helping people and having also that diversity in an organization.
And with early intervention, how much work can you get done there, versus the support they need?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It depends on the complexity, and I don't like talking about severity, but if there are very high needs, it can take a lot of work. Outcomes can be fantastic. The first little girl that I worked with here in Australia, she was nonverbal, not toilet trained, had very limited interest, was not socially engaged, and she's getting married next month. And so,
oh, beautiful.
Yeah, so it can go from that, but also some children, unfortunately, remain significantly impaired. And so what you want to do the best that you can, but you don't know necessarily where it's going to go. So our parents often ask me when I do an intake meeting at the end, will my child be normal? And we say, we don't know. And also normal, what is normal? So we try to work with family and say, we want to try and get the best outcome for your child and for your family. And that often goes back to being able to advocate for yourself, being autonomous, making decisions, having that skill set so your child can lead a happy as independently possible down the track. And we don't know, when children are 2, 3, 4 years old, you don't know. But we like children to become happy, thriving adults who, if they want to work, to be able to access work, if they want to go on holidays, to access that, if they want friends, if they want to socialize in a particular way. How do you meet, those adults' needs? But that starts very early.
Yeah. And what if that early intervention is missing? What are the problems that come from it?
Yeah, it can be very tricky. I've worked with adults who are not toilet trained, so there's a much higher risk of abuse. There's a much higher, if you can't communicate your needs, there's a much higher risk of self-injurious behavior, not creating the right environment, because it becomes, you then need so much more specialist support. And that's also a thing in the media, because people who are neurodiverse and they're verbal, you see those in the media, and then often you see really difficult stories with individuals and young adults or adults who can't get their needs met. And so there's that whole spectrum. So we want to support both ends. We want to support the adults who are unable to communicate or communicate effectively to us. How can we meet their needs? How can we give them happy environments where they can live their life, but also people who are very verbal and very creative? It's just a different way, and that's a whole spectrum of different support that individuals need.
And can people still access support? 20s, 30s?
Yeah,
40s?
You can. It just becomes a lot more specialist support that is needed. So there can be more behaviour support, speech pathology, occupational therapy. Individuals, if their parents can no longer care for them, then they might go to supported independent living. So there's a variety of options there, but it gets tricky. What do they exactly need?
It's very interesting because, like I said earlier, I really thought that there was going to be very specific how to deal with eye contact and how to do this and that, but
No.
We're all sussing each other out and
Yeah.
figuring out
If you've
what people are
met
good at.
one neurodiverse person, you've met one neurodiverse person. They're all so different. So I can't give you anything specific. It's just that there's a whole spectrum from very high needs and needing a lot of support. We like to think of functional capacity. What is your functional capacity? Where would you like to go? And what's the gap? And that's where sort of the scaffolding occurs in that gap.
Yeah, beautiful. And if people want to find out more about Aspire, where can they go?
They can just Google, they can go to the website, or they can call us.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you so much.
No problem.
For coming and talking to us. That was really enlightening, and that's
Thank
really
you.
helped me with my thoughts on things. Because I'd love to be able to support more people who are neurodiverse. Because they're working in a creative agency, like they are more visual and more, you know, on a different spectrum to possibly other
Just
people.
have the conversation and understand that sometimes it may take a bit longer or more conversations than neurotypical people. And I think just continuing being open and saying, how can I help you? What do you need to thrive in this environment?
Beautiful. Right, well,
Thank you.
Hope you got something out of that too. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you next week.